from Zimbabwe, Minister Walter Mzembi, and he's going to be delivering a lecture to a couple of students and a couple of visitors as well who've come in. And his lecture is going to be based on Zimbabwe post-land reform, international re-engagement drive, success, failures, and lessons learned. Thank you for joining us today on Zimbo Live TV. And today's broadcast is made possible by our proudly sponsors, Broderbrook Academy from Harare in Boda, a top-class academy based in Zimbabwe. Please do join us tonight as we give you more on the minister and what he has to give tonight. Remember, if you want to be part of this broadcast tonight and you want to have your views aired out as well, hashtag Zimbo Live TV and give us your views. My name is Vicky Storm, and stay tuned for tonight.
Honorable Minister, members of the Society, and ladies and gentlemen. My name is Malvin Lebega. I'm the President of the Oxford University Africa Society. We're hosting this talk, and we hope that through this evening you may get to engage meaningfully about the continent, particularly Zimbabwe. As a matter of housekeeping, I'd like to say at the outset that this session is being recorded by Zimbo Live. However, it's not a live stream, so it will be edited and cut accordingly, but just so that you are aware at the outset. In terms of a brief background to the society, the Oxford University Africa Society is essentially the melting pot for African student thinking within the university. Not necessarily African students, but those who care about the continent, want to think about it, and want to influence its future. So from that perspective, some of the events we hold range from creating opportunities for students to go back to the continent, or to return to the continent, or to work on the continent, but in the same vein, to engage on the continent. And events like these, this evening particularly, speak to engaging with issues on the continent and providing some sort of short leadership on events and issues that relate to Africa. I'd now like to hand over to our Honorable Vice President, Zimbo Chigudu, who will lead the discussion today, introduce the topic and the speaker. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Melvin. So just to restate, my name is Zimbo Chigudu. The session that we have, we're very privileged and indeed honored to have the Minister, Walter Mzembi, speaking to us this evening. The way the event is going to unfold, we'll spend the first half hour or so with the Minister speaking and giving a talk that he's prepared. That will be followed by a question and answer round in which you'll have opportunities to engage the Minister directly, both on what he's presented and on broader issues and concerns and questions that you may have about Zimbabwe. So without further ado, I hand over to the Minister.
Thank you very much. Honorable Vice President, sir. The indications I got, I hope you can hear me at the back. Can you hear me? Okay. The indications I got from your presidents here was that I should speak specifically to two issues, to Zimbabwe's land reform program, highlighting its successes and failures, lessons learned, and Zimbabwe's post-international re-engagement drive. And I decided to coin a topic which would assist me last night in putting down some notes that I shall speak to regarding these two concepts. And the topic shall read Zimbabwe's post-land reform international re-engagement drive, successes and failures, and lessons learned. I start by describing the expectations of the 150,000 white community after our independence in 1980, that there was a natural expectation for the new government after the brutal liberation war to exercise retribution. But in order to assuage white fears then and underscore reconciliation, the Lancaster House Agreement, which you are all familiar with, and I'll start with the politics, guaranteed 20 seats plus 2 cabinet portfolios, one of which had to be agriculture, out of the country's combined 150 seats in the lower and upper house. The lower house at 100 seats, and the upper house, which was ordinarily referred to as the Senate, had 50 seats, altogether 150 seats. And out of that, we had to set aside for the first decade of our independence 20 seats for our white brothers. And by all means, obviously, this was a very generous gesture, amounting to 13% of parliamentary seats and 10% of cabinet seats for less than 5% of the country's population then. But we had to give in at independence, or just prior to independence, to some of these concessions in order to secure our freedom, but most importantly, peace. But I would like to point out upfront that generally the people of Zimbabwe were not happy with these concessions. That included a willing buyer, willing seller arrangement or model for disposing lands to the black majority then. They felt a natural sense of betrayal on these special privileges, which would entrench racism and social Darwinism until year 2000. And at the same time, we obviously had to come up with a new statecraft that would capture the security structure, which President Mugabe proceeded to conceive under General Peter Walls and a host of other Rhodesian military personnel as commanders of the newly integrated army, which was actually trained by the British. They were called BMAT. Our first crop of independent Zimbabwe National Army, Air Force, and other quasi-military structures were actually trained by the British, what we popularly referred to then as BMAT. And they were obviously comfortable with General Peter Walls, and President Mugabe considered and appointed General Walls as the first commander of the combined army. But we thought reconciliation had been taken a little bit too far, and all hell broke loose when the land and wealth issues were finally confronted. In fact, there was a period, almost a honeymoon period, for our white population in the country, up to almost year 1998, and pressure began piling on President Mugabe and ZANU-PF, the party then, to begin to confront some of the issues that had actually taken us to the bush. But this happened on the back of the knighting in 1992 of President Mugabe as commander of the Grand Cross of Bath by the Queen. The Queen had just also concluded a visit in 1991, and even earlier, the late British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had visited in 1998 in March. But all these honors on President Mugabe disappeared overnight, and he turned into villain the moment he started addressing the contentious issue of land reform. So, in understanding the Zimbabwean question today, as you follow it, is so super critical that we begin to question what occasioned the sudden change of editorial tone on Zimbabwe reporting from about year 2000. But in order to understand that, and to understand the land question itself, it is important that I share with you what Rhodesia was and how it came into being. And I'm happy that I'm giving this lecture from Oxford, because Oxford, this institution, was the genesis, part genesis of social Darwinism, developed by, amongst others, a group of scholars on the eve of the partition of Africa. Many of you would recall the Berlin Conference ushered in a very ugly period of greed, avarice, and broken treaties that led in the first instance, or were led in the first instance, by spiritual marination, led by missionaries and missionary explorers in the likes of Henry Morton Stanley, our famous David Livingstone, and others. But Darwinism itself sponsored the survival of the fittest and natural selection philosophy, which was brutally exploited in the colonial oppression by the likes of King Leopold of Belgium. And even in Zimbabwe today, just for you to understand how omnipresent Darwin was, we still have a mountain, one of our most sacred mountains in Zimbabwe, is actually named after Darwin. And I know that very few people connect this Mount Darwin to Darwin, the one that we are discussing here. But we have this name of this mountain, which was otherwise known locally in our language as Mount Fura, as one of the legacies of colonialism that even to our disbelief survived name changes after independence. So we have that mountain today. Now, I don't want to imagine that this was a celebration of scientific prowessness. It was clearly colonial rather than the scientific Darwin that has been taught to us for time immemorial. In our view in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia in Africa was the incomplete journey to the wide Commonwealth as represented by Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and even the United States. And I quote below so that you may understand what was happening then. Some of the famous quotes of grand acquisitions of that time to demonstrate the self-fulfilling prophecy of the fathers of colonialism. And to start with Charles Darwin himself, and I quote, open quote, he said at some stage that at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of men will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world, close quote. And I proceed to quote one grand acquisitor in the form of Christopher Columbus of the Spaniards' conquest, and open quote, he mentioned that the best thing in the world is gold. It can even send souls to heaven. Gold, the gold that we celebrate today, close quote. A third quote from the one who captured Mexico, and here I quote Hernando Cortez, very famous in the Spaniard world. Open quote, we Spaniards suffer from a disease of the heart, the specific remedy of which is gold. Close quote. But it was Rhodes in this very city, and at Oriel, his Oxford statement about his mission to colonize the globe, that is more pertinent to Zimbabwe's history. And I quote him, open quote, I contend that we are the first race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better for the human race. I contend that every acre added to our territory provides for the birth of more of the English race, who otherwise would not be brought into existence, close quote. That was the philosophical foundation of Sister John Rhodes' expeditions into Africa. Rhodes would proceed to work with the Scots doctor, Leander Starr Jameson, famous for his abuse of morphine treatment on King Lobengula scout ailments. You know, the Ndeweles in my country, they are the big chewers of meat. They eat meat in tons. And they like it, in fact, not well done. They like it medium to rare. So naturally, they were victims of gout ailments. And our good doctor, Leander, knew the connection between morphine treatment and the gout, just to kill the pain. And King Lobengula actually became very dependent on morphine treatment to the extent that it was killing his pain. The good doctor actually became a very close accomplice, taken to the heart and trusted so much. The other third accomplice was Alfred Bate, the German Jew, on a Southern African context, initially successful in South Africa, where, of course, he was to join Rhodes as Prime Minister of the Cape from 1890 to 1896. But we all know what happened to Sisu Rhodes, John Rhodes in South Africa, the Anglo-Boer War, and eventually his demise, that eventually persuaded him to turn his attention to the north, where he would use missionaries, concession hunters, and the military to eventually conclude the Rad concession on 3rd October 1888. And the Rad concession, which basically became the document that created colonial Rhodesia or Southern Rhodesia initially. I want to quote it for you so that you understand this land question in Zimbabwe. It was not a concession that was giving Southern Rhodesia then, or Rhodesia, to the pioneers. It was actually giving them a totally different package. And I quote here, it says, "I grant complete and exclusive charge over all metals and minerals in my kingdom, principalities and dominions, together with full power to do all things that they may deem necessary, to win and procure the same, and to collect and enjoy the profits and revenues, if any, derivable from the said metals and minerals," close quote. This was supposed to be Lobengula having acceded to this, and I wonder how he had learned so much sophistry in English to the extent where he would have captured the concession in this very verbose language. But the concession became obviously the subject of manipulation. You read it, and I could repeat it, it does not grant land here or leasing rights, but it was later meant to grant land and leasing rights, including renting in Lobengula's name. And it did not take time for Lobengula to query the Rad concession. And many of you would recall from your English and history texts that he actually dispatched envoys by the name Babiana and Mshete being dispatched here to London. You can imagine those two villagers making a journey to London in those times, sent by Lobengula to come and query what he was being told to have signed to. And in very simple language, which was interpreted by Johann Collenbrander, the interpreter then, Lobengula inquires from the Queen, from Queen Victoria, and I quote him here. "Your Majesty, what I want to know from you is if people can be bought at any price," close quote. And Queen Victoria proceeded to answer him, again through the interpreter, that "I wish the king to know that the people that are now occupying his land have done so without my authority." She was clearly a very noble woman, the Queen Victoria. She disowned this, said, "No, they are doing this without my authority," close quote. But in between this time and the eventual granting of the Royal Charter, which basically placed authority to Rhodes through the British South African Company, there was a lot of delaying and hiding of information from the Queen, and that timing difference was exploited to Rhodes' advantage. And eventually, the Queen Victoria was made to sign the provisions of the Royal Charter that promised the Crown to intervene on behalf of Africans, because she still did not trust Rhodes' intention on Southern Africa, and she wanted those guarantees that she could still intervene on behalf of Africans should the BSAC abuse its authority. But these provisions were never invoked, and apparently this was the genesis of great distrust. I want you to know when we started distrusting each other, and I'm happy that today I had a chat with the Foreign Commonwealth Office, and I was reciting some of these past violations of trust between us and our colonial fathers. So there was no invocation and that distrust was created right during decolonization, up to Clay Short's time of authority without responsibility. Many of you would know that what actually got Zimbabwe withdrawing from the Commonwealth was Madame Clay Short's own unilateral statements on the issue of land, where she said that they were under no obligation during Tony Blair's time to pay for the sins of their fathers. And that was what broke the camel's back in the year 2002, I think. Now, from there on, what is very interesting is that Cecil John Rhodes' Escape to Cairo dream was later to receive recognition in the form of an honorary degree this year from this very institution I speak from today, Oxford University. Rhodes scholarships have been bestowed, you know that, by Oxford University for time immemorial. And one of the most famous beneficiaries of this scholarship program is my favorite president, Bill Clinton, who was a recipient. And principally, the essence, the philosophical essence of this was go into the world and spread enlightenment. Clearly an ideological thrust from Rhodes on educational his educational philosophy. What happened thereafter, of course, was that in 1890, on the 13th of September, the first column of pioneers erected the Union Jack on Fort Salisbury as a result of all this deceit that I've described. I want you to absorb this so that you understand that the genesis of the Zimbabwe land question is and does not begin in the year 2000. It is a foundation going right back into colonial time, and fortunately it has been captured very, very intimately by our 14 million population, most importantly because of their literacy. We are the most literate country in Africa at 94%, and we do nothing but read and read and read and read. So we are quite conversant with this history. Now, how did the system then reward the pioneer column? Now, I want you to understand how this whole land question started. Each pioneer was given 6,000 acres for having arrived at Fort Salisbury. 6,000 acres and 15 mining claims. 6,000 acres, 15 mining claims. But they had learned without cattle 500,000 Matebele cattle plus other livestock were also raided from the then Africans to give and equip these new settlers, not paid for. They were part of what Dr. Jameson then referred to as the Victoria Agreement. Rhodes was later to be made by Queen Victoria, the same Queen Victoria, as Privy Councillor under your system here of honoring your heroes, knighted and marking the final endorsement of the colonial effort on behalf of the Crown, not, of course, withstanding the deceit and criminal intent under which the land had transferred hands. The rest of what followed is now history, ladies and gentlemen, with several land commissions, beginning with the first one in 1894, coming on the back of an influx of white settlers in the same year who were responding to adverts that were being flighted here in London of a new El Dorado in southern Rhodesia. And they would advertise new finds in southern Rhodesia, and saying that it was getting richer and richer as you went deeper. And there was a massive response. That massive response in itself created a great pressure on land then, and marking the beginning of the creation of what we call the reserved land, where the blacks were now being pushed to create room for this incursion of white settlers. That land had no mineral rights. You could not mine if you were a black person. You were just moved in there to do some basic agrarian enterprise, but not allowed to to mine anything. In 1923, the Britain itself approved a whites-only responsible government for Southern Rhodesia. It was a product of the emerging conflict between the British South African Company and the new settlers, because land transfers and sales were now accumulating into company accounts. And the new settlers said, no, I think we are responsible enough. Please give us a government. And the British government then acceded to that. I think it was under Churchill or somebody. By 1930, the Land Apportionment Act then was beginning to set aside, typically now along racist lines, all good lands for the whites, all barren lands for the Africans, in what now they were terming clearly as reserves. But let me share with you what broke the camel's back, how the liberation struggle was inspired out of this behavior. It was the Land Husbandry Act of 1951 that sought to release more productive land to Africans, but compelling them only to till 6 acres out of the 100 acres that was allocated to each African. It would be allocated 100 acres, but out of 100 acres, 6 acres would be what you would till. The rest, because it was very hilly and hilly outcrops and so forth, they said, look after cattle, but you cannot carry more than a certain number. That does not relate to the carrying capacity of 100 hectares. So it marked the beginning of massive destocking of cattle and other livestock by the Africans, not voluntarily, by Shambok. If your 100 acres could not carry, they would take the rest and sell it back to the white settlers. And inevitably, it sowed the first seeds of dissent. Now, I want you to understand what cattle mean to us, even up to this very day. It's still a medium of exchange. It's still a symbol of wealth. It's still, when I want to marry her, for example, her father will then charge lobola to me, 20 cattle. So if you don't have 20 cattle, you can't get a woman, you see. So now when you take the cattle away from me, it means you are taking even my right to marry. And you can understand what sort of tension it caused. It became really just the decimation of our value of exchange, in lobola exchange, the beasts of burden in tilling our land and so forth. But apart from that, we were subjects of a lot of rustling, cattle rustling by the whites, and most of our cattle was sold at a fraction of the price. And I can tell you, this really was the genesis of dissent and what we term as the liberation struggle. So we went right up to 1979, disenfranchised as the majority blacks, and many of us had not seen the ballot box until 1979, beginning of 1980, when we went to elections. The 0.05% that was allowed to vote there, to earn it, you had to show that you are a good African, including on imbibing clear beer. You recall that our fathers were not even allowed to drink clear beer. You had to be issued with a certificate to drink a Stella, because an African was not considered strong enough to be able to contain the effects of intoxication. This is clearly what was happening up to 1979. So we were very much victims of the politics of subsistence, with no property rights, no ownership of anything. But I don't intend to lecture you on the liberation war. Suffice to say that the two grievances of our liberation struggle was universal franchise, one man, one vote, and the most important one, of course, was the second one, land to the people. Now, with this whole background and description that I've given you, no wonder why you would then see people expressing exasperation with President Mugabe then and the government for not delivering on the deferred dream, on the promise of the struggle which sought to put land in the hands of black people. There was a moratorium coming together with the Longest House Agreement, which did not allow us to buy land unless if we were doing so on a willing seller, willing buyer basis. But because of the protections that I have already mentioned in the preceding paragraphs, the white population, Rhodesian population, was not willing to even part with that land. Zimbabwe is some 39.6 million hectares of land, and 33 million hectares are arable. Out of the 33 million hectares that were arable, more than 50% of it was in the hands of between 4,000 to 6,000 whites, with the rest of us consigned to hilly outcrops, unable to farm. And what we're simply asking for at the beginning was a social justice, equitability, and unfortunately, our white brothers were not willing to part with that land. And it put us in a corner as the ZANU-PF government, because we're now being asked to deliver on the promises of struggle. And clearly, after that, we remained from 1980 to about 1999, organically separate in all respects. Clear evidence of the extension of apartheid South Africa, which was very much rife then, just across the Limpopo. Meanwhile, on the economic front, the post-independent honeymoon euphoria obviously was over for the blacks, and matters were not made lighter by the demise of the USSR, which then compelled the IMF and World Bank prescription of structural adjustment programs from the early 90s, two phases of which brought a lot of economic hardship and economic failure and subsequent hardship on our masses. So we suddenly started remembering that we went to struggle for land because the employment honeymoon of the post-independence euphoria was over. Now we remember that the reason why we went to struggle was actually for land. Now let's go and claim it back. And in the process, obviously, we did what we did, which was not acceptable to the international community, what we referred to then as a fast-track land acquisition program, the consequences of which obviously attracted the punitive measures that came from the European Union under Article 96 of the ACP Cotonou Agreement. They still hoped that we would continue to negotiate and negotiate, but we said we were going to do it the Zimbabwean way, what we would have done in 1980, but we were stopped by the moratorium and proceeded to acquire the land, the results of which you all know imposed sanctions on the country. The Anglo-Saxon response was absolute disengagement. So through Article 96 of the Cotonou Agreement, ACPU was unilaterally revoked, citing abuse of human rights, breakdown of rule of law, and the unacceptable presidential election in 2002. The first two, abuse of human rights and breakdown of rule of law, were completely disregarded by our people. In fact, dismissed with a lot of disdain because they didn't know which rule of law we were being persuaded to go back to if Rhodesia was what I've just characterized to you. And if our colonial history was what I've just shared with you, they didn't know what rule of law we were being persuaded to go back to, which was so unjust. And the issues relating to presidential elections obviously became the subject of conversation that we eventually entered into as Zimbabweans amongst ourselves. We didn't need actually any persuasion from external parties to find each other. We actually went into a 4-year conversation under an arrangement called the Constitutional Review, which brought in a constitution that we all voted 98% during the inclusive government, which was a compromise between us to find ourselves going forward. Now, I want you to know that the only unilateral action that we took in disengaging from the international family of countries was our withdrawal from the Commonwealth, where we were not finding any sympathy with peer club members in understanding this land question. And in fact, what really hurt us was that those that we thought would know better, also products of colonialism, became our most vociferous opponents. And they included Canada, Australia, and America. Now, all these three countries were the product of a colonial history and journey. And you know the bloody war that was fought in the United States, in America, to gain their own independence. You know what iniquities were exercised on the indigenous populations of the Aborigines in Australia and the Indian population of Canada in order for the settler communities of that time to assert their rights over land and everything. So we found it a bit paradoxical that this would be the same countries failing to understand what we were actually going through in trying to reassert our own authority over our own land and our own resources. But the rest obviously is history. Now, just to wrap up, because this was really the fundamental issue that brought us to the state of disjuncture, I want to say that the major reason why the European Union put us under sanctions was they were citing the loss of 7 white lives out of 200 people who are presumed to have lost their lives during our fast-track land reform program. And it happened during a time when there was an equal process taking place in South Africa from round about Mandela's time. In fact, it was presided over during Mandela's time, the extermination, the murder, criminal murder of 1,202 white farmers in the 7 years leading to 2001 under Nelson Mandela and subsequently Mbeki. These whites were being killed in South Africa. Characteristically, they were all white farmers. The same pressure that we were exerting on Zimbabwe was happening in South Africa. We regrettably lost 7 lives. South Africa lost 1,202, but we received unequal responses from the international community, just to demonstrate the paradox here. Now, where are we? It is instructive to note that we are back, I think, now to where we should have been in dialogue, really, because the accompanying measures relating to the invocation of Article 96 of the Cotonou Agreement resulted in the EU making a decision that they were not going to budgetarily support the government of Zimbabwe. So some $2 billion has been spent on Zimbabwe, but through non-governmental organizations in the last decade, unaccounted for by my government, but basically coming for subsistence support. The revocation of Article 96, which happened last week, because we are back together now with the EU, is meant to result in direct budgetary assistance by the EU on Zimbabwe. So maybe we'll begin to apply these funds as a government. I don't know whether the NGOs that received that $2 billion can account for anything other than subsistence support that took place in the last decade. I submit that you know that Japan and Germany, after the world wars, were actually built with, or rebuilt with money from their former foes, and we have argued our case to no avail. Germany and Japan were built out of the Marshall Plan, rebuilt. Africa, notwithstanding the slavery, which was not compensated for, the colonial decolonization period, which was not compensated for, and in my specific case of Zimbabwe, the post-independent sanctions period, which has also not been compensated for, it brings us to the point where we say, if my country, for example, owes $7 billion to international creditors, as it does to the IMF, to the World Bank, to the Paris Club, and that $7 billion has been accrued by our inability to service the debt purely arising out of the sanctions that have prevented us from servicing this debt. For us to be able to service it, we have to have our own Marshall Plan, which I think academics like you can debate and say, what can we do to Zimbabwe in order to imbue back in it a capacity to service its debts. But debt forgiveness, debt cancellation, those are political solutions. And that's what the Marshall Plan did on Japan and Germany. So if we are to get back fully, there's a case for us to compute the cost of sanctions, and I put it at about $100 billion. Now, if I placed a $100 billion invoice on Europe today, including your country, I'm surely going to be able to pay $7 billion. But if we are unable to compute this and acknowledge it, it means we have to put a payment plan that far outweighs even our budgetary levels as a country today. So I submit to you academics that what is good for the goose is good for the gander. If debt forgiveness succeeded in bringing back Germany and Japan, if a Marshall Plan succeeded in bringing back Germany and Japan, you should be advocating yourselves for a similar proposition and response to a Zimbabwe that has not been given any respite from the period that I've worked with you in 1888 to date. We have not been given any respite. We have not been compensated for anything, but we have been on a journey of extreme hardship and pain, which deserves really the attention of the people that I have already spoken to. I want, for now, to pause here and reserve my last two paragraphs for how I want to conclude this lecture going forward. But you are free to field any questions, starting with this one, to where you think we should be going forward. I'll field any question. I thank you so much. I decided to cut so that.
Well, thank you very much, Minister. I think you've given us a very juicy narrative for us to sink our teeth into and open some debates. I mean, as you yourself have highlighted, the land question in Zimbabwe has deep historical roots and has been the cause of much grievance and contestation. But of course, even the narrative that you provide is a perspective that I think people will have different thoughts on, will want to challenge and corroborate in different places. And I think even going right through from the structural adjustment to the controversy with Claire Short, there are a number of opinions about the different ways in which donors have and should have engaged with Zimbabwe. And so I think I'm quite excited to see how we proceed with the questions. So I think that the way we'll do it is we'll take questions in rounds of about 3. If you could please just introduce yourself, say who you are and what you do, so that the minister knows who he's addressing. There is a roving mic, so just wait until you receive the mic before answering your questions.
Good evening, Mr. Minister. Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Matthew Delahaye. I'm South African. I did a Master's in African Studies last year, and I'm now at the Business School. I want to ask a question about the land reform program. With the context and the historical background that you gave us, it's very difficult to argue against a sensible program that would set that right, especially when you bring up South Africa, where 1,200 people, you said, were killed, as opposed to 7 white people, farmers in Zimbabwe. I think the difference is, though, that rightly, implicitly, like explicitly or not, in Zimbabwe, which was not the case in South Africa, it came across that the state was sanctioning this kind of behavior, that you had war vets, many of whom couldn't possibly have fought in the war, going around terrorizing farmers, and not just white farmers, but terrorizing black people who did not agree with them politically, and not only for the benefit of a broad range of Zimbabweans setting this right, but for a group of people who are politically well connected, which I think accounts for a lot of the backlash, which does not go with it's inconsistent with saying they don't agree with sorting out the history. It's something else. Thank you.
Okay, so while people are mulling over what they want to ask, do you want to go ahead and address this question on state-sponsored violence during land reform?
Yeah, in fact, that really was what appeared to be the area of disjuncture between us and the EU, the qualification of the violence. But even the 1,202 whites that were killed in South Africa, they were killed with with the government actually presiding over matters of the state in South Africa, an issue that they still struggle with, if I may use the freedom of this academic space to speak to these issues. But notwithstanding what you rightfully raise, there was still an agreement between all parties, opposition parties, ZANU-PF, and the white commercial farmers themselves, that this was justice delayed for so long that it was precipitating the kind of anger with which the war veterans then moved onto the farms, literally in the beginning allocating farms to themselves, a process that we took over through the law, now to prescribe laws of acquisition that would later take effect from about 2002 going forward. But fights over land the world over they are not wedding parties. People go to war for land for time immemorial, from Genesis to Revelations and thereafter. There is no contestation for land that is gone without blood being let, and we don't want to see that happen. But this is the nature of contestations around land, and I'm actually yet to see if there's going to be a repeat of our program, a program that can go so nearly perfectly with the 7 losses of white people, if they were the ones holding on to 70% of the land. I'm yet to see that, because this one that is going on involuntarily is already claimed up to the time that I'm reporting 2001, 1,202 lives. So there is something inherent in us, I think, as Zimbabweans also, that speaks to our constitution as a peaceful people. And this is why, notwithstanding even our own disagreements politically, we are still bound by the need to preserve life, to argue things intellectually, and wait for balloting time. And it clearly distinguishes Zimbabwe today in contemporary Southern Africa as the most peaceful country in Southern Africa. Ahead of anything that I market as Minister of Tourism, the peace dividend is what I sell. The stability in Zimbabwe is unparalleled. You can have the Victoria Falls or the pyramids of Egypt or Table Mountain, but if they are located in an acrimonious and a war zone, you will not be able to extract value out of those natural endowments. And I pride myself on presiding over a very peaceful asset called Zimbabwe today. And I can proudly command any platform in the world and say, here we are, very peaceful, but very noisy. It's arising out of what Britain taught us, the Westminster model. I was just listening now as I was being driven here to a debate in your parliament there. The way you disrespect even your own prime minister, you shout him down like a child, you know. But that's what we learned. A bit of that is what we learned from you, laced with a bit of our African culture. But we still remain absolutely a peaceful country. It is only in Zimbabwe where you can walk almost nearly naked. Nobody will torment you forever. That's the kind of freedom we have. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question at the back.
Robin Palmer, sometime historian. Over the last 10 years, a number of young Zimbabwean scholars have done really interesting research on the aspects of the land reform program, reaching many different conclusions. Is your government open to any kind of engagement with those scholars to discuss their work and implications for future work on land reform? Thank you.
Do we have any other questions from the floor at the moment? Okay, Minister, if you want to tackle that question.
Collaboration with, I mentioned, I think, ahead of this lecture, and I was bragging that we are the most literate country in Africa, not by our own scoring. It's endorsed by by the relevant UN agencies that 94%, we know nothing more than studying and research in Zimbabwe. And you are welcome. In fact, I'm busy going around the world promoting something that I'm now referring to in my portfolio as citizenship diplomacy, study abroad programs, where your students, research students, can come on student exchange programs or special programs designed to understand us better and place your work with our institutions. So we are very open to that. I was at State University of Ohio only just 6 weeks ago, and we commissioned that first ever study abroad program, which will see students from Ohio and later on to 10 universities in the Midwest coming to Zimbabwe to understand us a lot better, because I find comfort in engaging students at this level, because you are IT friendly, you are able to check things for yourselves, and you don't necessarily always make reference to state politics or the disjuncture between our states. You have that freedom that comes with being academics to check, assess, assert, and conclude your findings for us, both UK and Zimbabwe. So you are very welcome, and we could take your work through my ministry or your interaction with Zimbabwean institutions. I have that mandate under the citizenship diplomacy program that I have commissioned to engage you. Yeah.
So the gentleman there in the suit.
Hello, my name is Chofamba. I'm a Zimbabwean living in Oxford. My question brings us to the present. The re-engagement with the international community. You've hosted a delegation of British business persons, and the Danish as well have come on board the re-engagement train. And as you mentioned, Article 96 is being revoked. But now the re-engagement is happening at a time when there's a raucous within the ruling party over the succession of President Robert Mugabe. One would perhaps maybe say this suggests a sense of instability on the part of those that are coming to engage with you as they look at what is happening at the government of the day and within their ruling party, and perhaps maybe might have misgivings that there might not be sufficient focus on the work that needs to be done on the economy, on addressing the prescriptions that are in your blueprint, economic blueprint, Zim asset, and that perhaps maybe they might need to wait and see until you've sorted out your political issues. How do you respond to this?
Sorry, just before you take that question, do we have any other questions from the floor? No. Okay.
The lady, isn't it?
Is there someone?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we just want to take, I think we have two hands going up now.
I'm Fiona Armitage, part historian, part anthropologist. I was curious about your title because it seems to be a new one. Could you explain what it involves? You're Minister of Tourism and the Diaspora. So how does that work?
Okay, then my title.
Yes.
Okay.
And then we had another question here. Cosima, just the young lady.
Hi, I'm Beatrice Ricks, and I was just wondering, well, my question is quite linked to that gentleman's over there about what your view was on Robert Mugabe and the economy, and how the Zimbabwe economy was actually, in my knowledge, was quite good for Robert Mugabe sort of, he took some of the wealth for himself. Yeah, so just wondering what your view was on Robert Mugabe and the situation in Zimbabwe at the moment. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so we have three questions there. The first from Chafamba about the nature of re-engagement and whether that process is going to be distracted by the disputes over succession following President Mugabe. Then we had a question from Fiona just to clarify what it means to be a Minister of Tourism and Diaspora. And then our third question from Beatrice was asking from her understanding that Mugabe has appropriated a lot of state resources and what your view is on that.
Is what?
Appropriated state resources for personal gain, I think was the way I understood the question, and whether you had a view on that.
Well, the last one. Let me start with the last one. I'm not aware of any expropriation or appropriation. Much of our access to land is by way of offer letters, and I'm aware that well before even the onset of the land reform program, he already had a farm that he had bought. He bought with his own money, and a rural home, like many of us. We have two homes. We have the urban one, then we have the rural one. But he is also a citizen with full rights of access to national programs that empower the Zimbabwean population, and is not an exception to land offers that we have all benefited from. I can share with you that in the period leading up to today, we have had through three resettlement programs. From 1980 to 1998, the number of families that were resettled in Zimbabwe amount to 71,000. From 1998 to year 2000, which was what we referred to as second phase or phase 2 inception, we resettled 4,697 families. Fast track phase, we resettled 164,064 families, bringing us to a total of 239,761 families that have been or that have benefited from the land reform exercise. Mugabe is part of the beneficiaries, and he is an equal right, just like me and everybody else, and my accompanying delegation from Zimbabwe here, to have a farm allocated to him. I was asked a question on Hard Talk on cronyism, which I granted the question. I think it was Stephen Saka. I said to him, yeah, of course, you will never eliminate cronyism anywhere in the world, even here in your own midst, in the British system, under your lordship system. Who owns land, or who is to own land? It's the lords. So those are the cronies of this country, or this empire. So you can grant that 10 to 20% cronyism, but who are the rest of these 210,000 families? Surely they can't all be Mugabe's cronies, you see? So let's be a bit scientific even as we analyze these numbers. So I always grant a leader, including myself, some kind of cronyism, because my families, immediate families to me, cannot suffer while I administer over matters of the state. I forget my brother or my sister. If I have access, they must benefit. But it does not preclude or exclude the greater majority whom we have been commissioned to serve. And these are the 210,000 families that I share with you today. Concerning the title of this minister, I'm Minister of Tourism and Hospitality Industry. I had an economic pillar in Zimbabwe together with three other pillars that have been identified under our Zimbo asset program. And they include mining, manufacturing, and agriculture. So I'm heading the tourism pillar. Why is it significant in our economic turnaround? Because it is a low-hanging fruit. We don't need to invest extensively in this sector. Just with a few policy approaches, a different approach, opening up the destination, we call it open skies, open borders, we can achieve significantly some traction in the tourism sector. In 1999, on the eve of the land reform program, we were receiving upwards of 560,000 visitors from Europe and America. And they were our biggest spenders. They would spend $1,200 per trip. By year 2008, that figure had fallen to about 224,000. Really almost a 50% drop in that high expenditure market. That market was 27% of our total arrivals into the destination. So it slumped to 13%. My recovery strategy is that we start with that market first before we even delve into new ones. We need to recover the our lost market share in Europe. And the basis of bringing back this ministry as a standalone ministry was to bring focus and to give me focus on the recovery of this sector, which clearly is the painkiller of our economy, while we look at medium to long-term issues that are related to mining, agriculture, and manufacturing. Tourism can do it for us. In South Africa, it is a $12 billion economy. In Zimbabwe, it is a $1 billion plus economy. But I can share with you that in 1996, OR Tambo was less busier than Harare International Airport. Harare International Airport was the air traffic hub of Southern Africa. But after the destination attacks arising out of our disjuncture with Europe and the United States, we took a slump. Today we are really, we pale into insignificance when compared to the activity that is taking place at OR Tambo. But we can get back, and our strategy is actually to get back. And we are saying by year 2020, the sector that I administer will be a $5 billion economy, and mainly out of a revision of policy approaches and instruments. We want to open the destination a lot more. And in doing that, I'm guided even philosophically by Christianity. My favorite prophet in the Bible is Isaiah. So if you go to Isaiah chapter 60, it is a chapter on arise and shine. Verse 11 speaks specifically to the tourism sector. And I quote it. It says, keep thy gates open. Keep thy gates open. Do not close them during the day. Do not close them during the night, so that you may enjoy the wealth of the Gentiles with their kings in procession. Close quote. So you are the Gentiles that we are expecting to receive in Zimbabwe. We want your money. There is no science to tourism. Very simply captured under what I refer to as the 4Gs of tourism. Get them in, get their money, get them out, get them back. Simple. So we are welcome to visit Zimbabwe. In fact, it will be a travesty of justice and an iniquity on your part to not visit one of the 7 wonders of the world, natural wonders of the world, named not after my African queen, no, after sharing with you here, Queen Victoria. So please visit Queen Victoria's Falls in Zimbabwe. It's a lifetime opportunity, and we must all make sure that we come and see God's creativity at its best. You see it at the Victoria Falls. The last question, I think, related to
succession.
To succession,
engagement,
which really, to me, you know, when you approach conventions and congresses anywhere in the world, maybe in the USA or here, these are not wedding parties. These are power contestations. And many of you would recall the acrimonious relationship then between President Obama and Hillary Clinton. They only kissed after the other one got into office, and shook hands. And one became president, the other one became Secretary of State. And Zimbabwe is no exception. We are approaching a Congress. We need to put people in place, and others need to go home. And there's nothing amazing about what we are going through. when you approach your own conventions here, it gets really, really acrimonious. In fact, you debate so robustly that even your ministers here resign when they are giving interviews. That's how acrimonious it can be with power. And I find it quite natural. The only thing is you must budget for it. If you are in business, you must budget for the periods that politicians approach their conventions and congresses, that there will be some kind of downturn as we focus on power and power contestations. And take it within your strides if you are in business. If you are in academics, you then use us as case studies. Yes. But there's absolutely nothing untoward. Fortunately, in Zimbabwe, we have a constitution at national level that we agreed to, all of us, 98% yes vote to it through a referendum on how the people of Zimbabwe would like to be governed. The other contestations that are taking place in political parties, and it is not just in ZANU-PF. In the MDC, in the last week, these contestations claimed the scalp of some very popular figures amongst yourselves here in the academic community. Nelson Chamisa was vying for Secretary General of the MDCT. He's now an ordinary card-carrying member. So is Mashakada. So if it happens in the ZANU-PF camp, it should not surprise you, because we're in that season of political contestations, and there are victors and losers. But what is important is to be able to get back together and have a cup of tea after the contestations and live and govern in the national interest, in peace.
Right, so we have about 5 minutes left, so we'll do a final round of questions. We have a question over here.
If they don't have questions in politics, we end up our meetings with a song.
Well, before we get to the singing, we'll give one or two people the opportunity to speak their mind.
Thank you very much. My name is Nyasha Maradza, and I'm a researcher from the University of Reading. Basically, I'm researching on innovation, so that's my area. And I was quite keen to know what's going on in terms of supporting the parastatals that are in the system at the moment. Particularly, I'm thinking here about opening them up and encouraging more participants into the system, so that could drive efficiencies into the economy, because I think that ultimately might be the answer to innovation within the wider economy.
Okay, sorry, we have another question just here.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I'm Jodin Donyema. I'm a student here and I'm from Namibia. My question relates more to Africa than Zimbabwe specifically. In terms of the experience of Zimbabwe, how would you advise fellow African countries who are going through the same sort of land reform problems, but not necessarily because of a product of colonialism, but because of inequities within society? And how would you advise that we move away from these individualistic ways of land ownership towards more communal, as it was in the very beginning, in order to ensure that down the road, 10, 20 years, it's no longer a land individualistic issue, but it may well be a class and social status issue.
Any other questions? Okay.
Well, concerning land, land is actually, I assume many of you here are either Christians or Muslims, but at the end of the day, we all meet at one apex, God, isn't it? Some call him Allah. But land is God's own concept of empowerment. If you read the Bible from A to Z, from Genesis to Revelations, it's nothing other than the promise of inheritance. And it's not inheriting a nightclub or inheriting a school like Oxford. It's inheritance of land. It means that it was designed even right from creation, that land would be really the basis, the basics of empowerment of a people. Now, to the extent that you are able to distribute it equitably, then you get a fair game. and the case that I presented to you here at Oxford today relates to ownership of 70% of 33 or 39 million hectares being in the hands of 6,000 people, as opposed to the minuscule percentage that was being shared by the greater majority of 14 million people. Now, if you don't correct that injustice, you are likely to get the kind of acrimony that I described in my little lecture today. The corrections will not come without any shedding of blood, because the majority will obviously overwhelm the fewer that own so much. So we need to strive all the time towards the principles of equal redistribution of land, because inherent in land are minerals, there's water, and other forms of sources of wealth, and that's why it is a contentious issue. So I have no advice for anybody except to say that this is the inheritance that was provided for in the beginning, and we all have an equal right of access to it. The difference is a governing model from one country to another that seeks either to deprive or to empower. We have chosen to empower in Zimbabwe. We have chosen to redistribute, and that's why we moved away from 6,000 to 239,000. We said to those that do not or are not identified indigenously that they could still leverage with that land in business form, but not in ownership form, because I don't know whether it's very easy to own 200 hectares here in the UK. I think it's a pipe dream for me to ever imagine that I could have access to 200 hectares here. But my right of being created and born, my naturalization rights, my birth rights in Zimbabwe gives me that added advantage and head start, and that's where we should be. And I would hope that even these students, some of whom are Zimbabwean here, as they acquire skills in agricultural practice and what have you, they are able to come back home and get a piece of the action, so that you can show us what you have learned by way of better farming methods. You have an access and right to it as much as I have down there in Zimbabwe. So it's God's concept of empowerment, and it must be exercised. It's promised to Abraham, to Jacob, to Isaac, and it's promised to modern day Israel. It's promised to Zimbabwe as much as it is promised to the UK. Now, in terms of innovation, I spent a very interesting time about 2 weekends ago, at the University of Zimbabwe. And I was convinced at the end of their National Engineering Students Competition awards ceremony, which was preceded by 20-minute presentations on projects, contemporary projects that are answering Zima said, that the solution for Zimbabwe does not lie with us here as ministers. It is actually within the youth. It is with students at institutions of higher learning, because you are at your most creative, your most alert, your most endowed brain-wise when you are at college, and that's when the solutions can be tapped. So we need to find a way of tapping those solutions, creating incubation, business incubation for your innovation, converting your intellectual property, commercializing it, mentoring, all these things. We must look at that and look at them critically. My government has put in place what it calls a commercialization of innovation fund, but it has very little in it. I'm advocating through the Minister of Higher Education, after my day at the University of Zimbabwe, that we actually beef up this fund to a stage where it can convert projects, to a stage where it can incubate projects, to a stage where it can further research into some of the ideas that were proffered to us. And I can share just 2 with you. One project that came through on the day was a case by a Bulawayo student that Kamidem water, which was decommissioned in 1988, is in actual fact potable if it is properly treated. And what we were dealing with at that time, I think, was a dam full of water that runs to waste, that was decommissioned on the back of politics in the early 80s, arising out of our own political disjunctures then. And she put in a very powerful case that this water is in fact more potable than Lake Chiwere water. It can be treated by far lesser a cocktail of chemicals. It can be treated by a far lesser budget than Lake Chiwere water. And we ticked, we said, yes, this one should be supported. And let's support morally, spiritually, and politically to get Kami Dam water back on stream. The second project was on the treatment and recycling of garbage, conversion of it into biofuels and methane gas. We tested it and we realized that it could be done. And the third one was the recycling of oil, lubricant. We are spending about 1.9 billion US dollars in Zimbabwe per annum importing lubricants that we throw to waste. And there's so much of it contaminating the environment. This lady was able to demonstrate that she could recycle, that lube oil would be recycled with a 75% recovery rate, and it could be done as many times. And that's a 75% saving on the first tranche, which can be repeated so many times and save the country of the much needed foreign currency. The third one or fourth one, I don't want to go, there were 8, was relating to bore mills. You know the bore mill, that the beneficiation mill, after you extract ore, you put in a mill by attrition, you break down the ore to small aggregates that can then be crushed into pulp, which will then be distilled until you get the final product. She was able to demonstrate, and these are she's, the she's must be very proud. She was able to demonstrate that we could recycle waste metal, okay, scrap metal, and strengthen carbide and tungsten proportions from our waste and recycled metal to give a new bore that could crush better than the 20 million that we are spending on South Africa to import bore mill substitutes. So it was a very good day, and I said, wow, herein lies the solutions to our problems. And as Zima said, what we need to do is fund them so that we get a better catchment of these projects going forward. The prizes for the first winner was 1,500 US. I'm sure if we went back next year, which I have already done, with a bigger budget as a fellow of the Institute of Engineers, and say, no, your first prize next year will be 5,000 from 1,500. What do you think will happen? They won't sleep. But in not sleeping, they will come up with the solutions that we are seeking to fix some of our problems. So I'm with you, and we'll take it on board. Thank you so much.
Great, and I think on that positive note, we thank you, Minister. Okay, so I think that wraps up our evening. Thank you so much for your attention and engagement this evening. I think we've had a stimulating discussion and some great questions. So thank you so much for coming and supporting this AfriSoc event, and thank you again, Mr. Minister, for your
Wonderful.
time.
I will make a copy of my presentation available to your president, then you can circulate it at your own time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
An electronic copy.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Do you think it was good?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, very engaging. Mr. Minister, just a quick note. I'm doing my PhD at the moment here. Being Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want all this, or do you think?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for tuning in with Zimbo Live TV. This broadcast was made possible by Brook Academy in Zimbabwe, Harare, Borodale, a top-class academy based in Borodale. Now, you've heard so much from the Minister of Tourism and Hospitality, Walter Mzembi. And if you've got any more questions, remember to hashtag Zimbo Live TV, and your questions will be sent to him as well. And you could have your own discussions going on as well. Remember, the topic for today was actually Zimbabwe post-land reform, international re-engagement drive, successes, failures, and lessons learned. We've heard today from the Minister, Walter Mzembi. Thank you very much for tuning into Zimbo Live TV. My name is Vicky Storm.